All right. Welcome back, everybody, to another Future Focused, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience with the goal of keeping you 10 steps ahead. And that is actually a theme of this discussion because I'm joined by Benjamin Friedman, and we're going to be talking about not only what's going on in the sphere of artificial intelligence, but what could that possibly mean as we try and look into the future, specifically around startups and innovation and what that really can look like. So, Benjamin, and by the way, backstage, I forgot, do you prefer to go by Benjamin or Ben?
I do prefer Benjamin, and Christopher, I appreciate you asking.
Hey, you know what? I'm sensitive to ask about that because I'm Christopher. And I think when we first met, we shared the pain that we sometimes experience with trying to get people to go by the long version of your name when everybody wants to shorten it. Specifically in America, my colleagues and people I know overseas, it's not nearly as much of an issue. I think Americans are notorious for just shortening everything.
That's true. That's true. People in the U.S. feel like they don't have time. So that extra second is meaningful to them.
We're all so busy being productive and efficient or whatever
Yes.
it is that Americans like to think we're doing that we don't have time to even say people's full names. Well, so for folks who may not know who you are or your background, little bit of context into who you are. And if you'll get to know my style very much. I will probably jump in here and there to dive in because I love learning about guests and their backgrounds. So for people who you encounter, you bump into somebody at a backyard barbecue and they say, "What do you do, Benjamin? What is it that your job is?" How do you describe that to folks?
Sure. So I'll start in the past and I'll quickly fast forward to today so that we can then get into the future. So I've been working with startups over 20 years. I would come in and head business operations and finance, typically at the point when they had found product market fit and they're really ready to scale. And I would take that on as a full-time role. And then I finally realized that I would come in, we would go through like a fundraise or some sort of event. We would exit, and then I would get a pat on the back. "Hey, Benjamin, thanks for all your help. Good luck in your next job." And that was typically a 3-year cycle if all went well. And I thought that's the only way to live. And I finally realized 5 years ago that I could do what I do on a fractional basis, work with startups as needed. Once they plateaued or once they've hired in the role full time, I can move on and work with other clients. So I've been doing that, really emphasizing business objectives with metrics, along with leadership development and team building. So thinking about everything holistically from those two perspectives.
So I'm actually curious on this one. So because it's a targeted niche that you specialize in, but you're actually there at one of the most, in my opinion, interesting times in a company's development because they're past that kind of, at least from what you've described. So correct me if I'm wrong. They're past that stage of like proof of concept. Hey, we think we have a thing here. We're not, which can be a really messy, unsettling stage.
Right.
But then you're also with them to the point where they haven't quite gotten to the mature, keep the wheels turning, kind of business as usual type. You're right in that chaos stage. Is that accurate?
That is. And it's really finding the balance, putting in enough infrastructure so that the company can have a greater impact, whether that's through revenues, finding new markets, expanding their product features and opportunities. If it's a service company, it's really balancing that infrastructure with, hey, I joined a startup because it's exciting and I have a lot of responsibility and I want to do all these cool things. And so mindful of the key employees, don't want to become corporate tomorrow. How do we get from here to there?
So was that something, I mean, how did you end up focusing on that specific area? Like, did you just happen to find yourself? You just happened to be in that space? Or was it a specific thing where you went, I actually really like working with startups, but did you figure out and perfect your formula over time?
So it's funny. I went to grad school to study nonprofit administration. I took courses at the School of Social Work and the School of Business. And I came out and I thought, okay, I'm prepared to help run nonprofits. Jumped into my first nonprofit. It was very process driven. I'm not saying they're all like that, but mine was. And I'm like, oh, no, I can't stand this. I have to look at results. I have to try some things and learn from that. So then I jumped into a for-profit. It doubled in size, both revenues and team every year for 3 years. And Christopher, I became addicted. It was just crazy. I had 3 different jobs every year. The president's like, okay, that's covered. I want you to go ahead and do this because we haven't figured it out yet. And I was like, this is so exciting. And I kept trying to feed that addiction.
Well, because it almost, I've been in very, very large, stable organizations. I've been in large organizations that are going through turnaround, but then I've also had the opportunity to work in companies at a similar thing. And there is an energy in companies in that stage where you still have the flexibility to kind of play multiple roles and stay, in different things, and things are changing enough that it is really a very interesting space, but it's at least more stable than some of the folks I know who are really into like early stage companies. To me, I couldn't deal with, I've got 7 kids, so maybe some of it's just I need stability, but like some of the things I hear from them in the early stage, I'm like, I couldn't deal with the uncertainty of that, of, every month you're not quite sure whether the company's going to be solvent or not because you're just still winging it.
So it's interesting. I think in terms of founders are surrounded by uncertainty all the time. Yes, when you're in the early growth stage and you're just trying to get your first customer, you're just trying to get your first investor, it feels incredibly daunting. But once you get the first customer, once you get the first investor, now you've just replaced one problem with 3 new problems. And yes, it's 3 opportunities as well. There's a trade-off. But that uncertainty lasts, forever. And if you're like Kodak and you're like, oh, sitting on top of the world because everyone's buying film, and then all of a sudden you lose out, or you're Blockbuster and you're like, oh, well, this thing Netflix is doing is silly. Like everybody's going to come to our store and rent videos forever. That uncertainty always exists. It's just, it feels more certain if it's bigger because you're surrounded by a lot of people who share that uncertainty.
That's a fair point. You know what? That's a really fair point on that, because I actually see that a lot of times with people who sometimes fall into the false premise that having a stable full-time job is safer than, doing independent work or things like that. And again, it's a different animal, but it's not necessarily wildly different. Again, you look at the news right now, people are getting laid off left and right. The idea that, once you go work for a company, then you're safe. I'm sure it's the same in the startup world where it's like, well, yeah, you just have new problems to have to try and solve.
Exactly. So going from past to present, when I was talking about switching from the nonprofit, I was down to 2 choices. One was the e-commerce company I mentioned. The other was a fairly well-known brokerage called Lehman Brothers. And everyone just assumed Lehman Brothers was too big to fail. And by the time I left that startup, Lehman Brothers, it was underway to fail. So I thought I made a risky choice going to a startup. I'm like, well, I'm young. I have time to recover. This seems much more exciting. And then it turned out I made the safe choice. Fast forward to, news of last year, you're Sam Altman basically sitting on top of the world. And all of a sudden your board decides to kick you out. Now we know how that sort of turned around, but any of us thought, well, if anyone has a secure job right now, it's Sam Altman. And yet he was, let go and then of course brought back. But yes, that uncertainty is pervasive.
It is interesting. And again, what I've found over the years is people just have different risk appetites, and it's not necessarily, like you said, there's risk associated with any of it, but people are just more comfortable with certain kinds of risks than other risks. And it's more, again, kind of knowing, hey, what risks are you comfortable with and which ones aren't you? And based on that, you may make a decision on where you go. And ultimately, there's volatility across the board, but it's finding your own personal risk appetite.
That's right. And it's funny, a lot of people who are not entrepreneurs, they think of founders as the person who's mountain biking on the side of the cliff, or the person who is like skydiving and waits to the last second to pull their parachute. But in fact, the majority of founders are taking risks, but they're taking mitigated risks, and they're extremely careful about what risks they're taking. So it's not that they don't consider the risks or they're immune to the risks. In fact, they do, but they think it's a greater risk to do nothing at all, to sit back and not pursue your dreams, to not try to solve this problem that's burning in your head. That is the greater risk for them. And so they do go forward.
Well, and what's funny about this, and I think this does help set the table for some of the sustainable stuff behind what we're talking about in the future, because you do have to understand these things. But one of the things there is, and this goes back to a little bit of our jokes on American culture and like shortening people's names, but there is a little bit of this like maverick attitude in America where it's like, no, being an entrepreneur means you throw caution to the wind and you just do whatever and it'll see if it works out. And that's, I mean, like you, I know a lot of founders that is not their personality at all. They are not just taking blind risk and throwing caution to the wind and seeing what happens. They're very meticulous about how they choose to do, at least the good ones.
Right.
The ones who don't stick it very long, that's a different story. But the ones I know who are successful, it's a skill set of being able to quickly assess risk. And to your point, say the risk of not doing this is far greater than the risk of doing that.
No, I totally agree. And the second part of that is they are perceived as mavericks, but in fact, they are beholden to more stakeholders the more that their company grows. So you add investors, you add people to the team, you add more, high profile customers. If you go public, then all of a sudden you have all these, stockholders. You just become more and more acculturated versus being the maverick. And sure, you can throw caution to the wind, but we hear those tales where people have gotten successful and then they step off the cliff and then we just make jokes about them. So yes, it's a maverick perception is very off in both those regards.
Well, and even I think back to some of the folks that come to mind that probably personify this just taking wild eccentric risks with certain things. Oftentimes we see that 0.1% of folks who maybe have achieved such financial success, they literally have the money to just throw at it. And if it blows up, it's like, well, who cares? But I think the other thing with that is the really good founders I've known still wouldn't do it, even if they had that financial freedom, because of the fact it's not just about them. To your point, you're beholden to other stakeholders. And when you take these wild risks, people get hurt. And the good founders I know, going back to a theme we're going to talk about is the value in humanity, the really good founders, they care deeply about these people. And they know, hey, if I just go do a crazy thing, there's going to be people that are going to come along for that ride. And maybe I'll be fine, but they might not. And I don't just want to play with them as though they're just, pawns on a chessboard.
Right. I agree. There is that responsibility. They also feel responsible to solving the problem that set them on that course in the first place. And they realize that if they take too great a risk, then they will lose the traction and momentum that they've been having to solve that problem. So yes, it's interesting. It's tempting to see people as one-dimensional, and they're like, oh, this person's a maverick. Oh, this person's an innovator. But in fact, most successful founders, to your point, they're thinking through all the different permutations and scenarios and considerations as they move forward. And that pressure just grows and grows. It doesn't lessen once they have some money in the bank. It continues to grow.
Right. And the way they execute it becomes different because, as you get bigger, you have people surrounding you, helping you do these different things, or there's just, like you said, investors that are also influencing the decisions you're making along the way. So it just becomes, I think, exponentially more complicated, which my observation in knowing different founders is I see different folks who, again, they do well at different stages. Some, they can grow a company to a certain point and then it reaches a level of complexity. And I actually know one founder in particular, he just knows this about himself. And once he hits that point, he exits. He exits the company because he knows, he's like, I don't have the capability to grow it beyond this because it reaches a level of complexity that's beyond my comfort level. And so at that point, I'd rather exit and do something else and start over and let somebody else deal with that. And again, ego can get in the way of that real quick.
I totally agree. So I've worked with 5 different clients that have gone through M&As in the last decade. And that's, wonderful story. I've also worked with a number of founders, not to be named, where it did not turn out how they wanted. And one of the huge differences is that self-awareness that you mentioned, Christopher, the sense of, okay, I was able to go from 0 to 1, but I may not be the leader to go from 1 to 10, or I need to surround myself with other leaders who can bolster our ability to grow as a business. But it's a very different skill set to go, from $0 to $1 million or to 5 million, and then go from that 5 million to 50 million. And if you don't recognize that's a different skill set, you will be stuck at 5 million. And basically stagnation means implosion at some point. And that's
well, yeah, because you're either, the thing I've seen, and this isn't just startup, this is just the business world. There really is no complacency. You're either growing or you're dying.
That's right.
And that's just it. And so it's like, you think you're plateaued, but it's like, you're really not, because for every minute you're on that plateau, the market's changing, products are changing, consumers are changing. And so you're actually falling back. You just may not realize it. And to your point on the self-awareness, I've watched founders and known several who they didn't have that self-awareness. And I've watched them torpedo what could have been a really successful business because they didn't have that awareness to go, I need to let go and bring either others alongside or just hand this over to somebody and say, I've taken it as far as I can take it.
Right. And I think it's interesting because in order to grow your business to 1 million, 5 million, maybe even 10 million, you have to have a certain skill set and personality. You do have to micromanage. You do have to be on the front lines of every decision. You do have to reach out to customers and investors and everyone you're going to hire. You pretty much need to interview. I get it. But then to grow to the next level, you have to put all that aside. You have to turn 180 degrees and you have to learn how to delegate effectively. You have to learn how to let systems replace people in some cases. And I'm sure that'll get into what, we're really going to talk about here. And you have to think about, okay, what are the goals? Not necessarily what is the specific path that everyone has to follow, but what is the destination that I can set for everyone? What is our North Star? And that is an incredibly difficult transition that a lot of people, including founders, have a hard time making.
Yeah. Well, and you see this for folks who listen who may not be in the startup sphere. I see the same thing happen even internally with career latitude as people move into different career ladders. You may be a rock star individual contributor and extremely dynamic and able to do all this stuff. Not everybody makes the jump well to leading others and recognizing that frontline leadership where it's like you still need to be involved, but you need to start kind of working through others and not being the do it like me, but here's what we need to do. And then there's that next step where it's like, well, now you're managing managers where you're even one more step disconnected. And then you get to the executive tier where your decision-making it's just, there's different stages and it's not a good or bad. It's just to your point. It's that self-awareness of knowing either one, what new skills do I need to apply and what things do I need to shift out of, or just recognizing, hey, this is about where I want to stay. And that's totally okay.
No, that makes total sense. We're talking a lot about entrepreneurs, but in my mind, everyone is an entrepreneur in different ways.
You really are.
Yeah, if you have kids, you are a founder or co-founder in your family. In your case, it's certainly grown quite well. If you have pets, you have to consider that. And having a newborn pet is very different than having a mature pet. All right. And if that pet gets ill or sick, if you're in a volunteer organization, if you're a coach, all these different facets, your situation is likely going to change once you reach a certain point. Kids is an easy analogy. You're not going to treat your preteen the same way as your toddler, and they're not going to treat you with the same adoration either.
Very true.
Right? So if you treat that teenager like a toddler, they're going to, go off in the world and implode in kind of the same way that these startups do. So you have to adapt as things move along.
So, well, and I think that one of the things that I think is most fatiguing for people right now, and this will tie into where I want to go next with this, is how much faster that change is happening than it has in the past. So that actually leads to my next question for you on this. As you've worked with startups over the decades and you've watched some of the things. And then, the past 10, it didn't just happen in 2022. It's been happening for 10 years or so, where technology has really started accelerating things. As you look at the startup world, what are some things that you look at that you go, things are dynamically different today than they were 7, 10, 15 years ago? Let's start there, because then I want to get back to what's consistent, because I think that will help us get to, so as we look to the future, what things are the safer bets, or the things that you kind of know are consistent, and where are some of the things? So what are the things? Are there things that you look at that you go, this is actually very different? Like if you're going into the startup space today, this is different advice that I would give to somebody than I would have if I was working with somebody 10 years ago.
Sure, sure. So the history of starting companies, and I'm not going to go too far back, but a couple generations ago, you had to raise enough money to get a space and hire people and have equipment and buy inventory. And that was a significant amount of money. And sometimes you could do it through banks or mortgaging your house. And then all of a sudden, VCs came along, and that was another way to get enough money to start your business. And then roughly 20 years ago, you could get a computer or now a laptop and start your business that way. And fast forward to today, not only can you start a business at the cost of a laptop, you can automate a large part of your business, your marketing, your sales, your product development, any process in between, and you can start to use AI and other programs to really automate much of what you're trying to do, so that you can focus on your value proposition and distinguish yourself from competitors. That is incredibly different. The pace at which you can get out to market is now days instead of years.
Okay, so that's interesting. And I think in some ways, this comes with goods and bads, I can see but I do think when I talk to a lot of people who I've encountered over the years, when they think about starting a business, they do have, I think there's still a lot of people that have that 15, 20-year-old mindset of, well, if I'm going to start a business, I've got to do this and I've got to do this. And it feels very onerous. Like, oh boy, like I'm nowhere near ready to be able to do something like that. But what you just described, I think opens the door for a lot more people who maybe have some really good ideas or things that they think they could do to legitimately be able to start a business without necessarily having to be like, well, you got to, like you said, mortgage your house and be able to take out a second mortgage to be able to do some of this stuff, which I think has historically kept some people from going, I have a really good idea, but like, I'm not ready to go that deep with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we're going to talk a lot about pros and cons. And one of the trade-offs is when you started a business in the past, you had to field a lot of questions right away from potential investors or banks. And so you had to go through iterations of thinking through, okay, how am I going to solve this problem and run a business? Now, if you could do it almost overnight to start a business, presumably you're not getting a lot of feedback right away. But in this scenario, it's like, okay, well, how do I create that feedback? How do I slow roll into this? And some of the ways that, we'll get into is starting a business on a part-time basis or putting an MVP out there and letting people test it for a while. So even though you could technically start your business and maybe you happen to have, friends and family who could loan you $100,000, which is a great situation, and actually get that business pretty far down the road, that doesn't mean you should. And so maybe you should think back to 20 years ago and some of the things they were doing, and how is that pro useful for you today?
I was just going to say, that was going to be my question about the risks, is I can see the barrier for entry becoming so low now that before you had a lot more opportunity to get your teeth kicked in a little bit, where you're like, I've got this great business idea, I'm going to do this. And it was like, yeah, okay. You started going through it and you had a little more opportunity to go, oh, this actually, I either need to refine this business idea, or maybe this isn't as great as I thought as it was. And you kind of had a little bit more runway, where I can see now somebody could go head first into it, think they have a great business, but really it's not all that great. And you would have to be more intentional of finding that feedback loop to actually make sure you're validating it so you don't go too far down a path.
No, that's totally true. Like, let's think about some of the businesses that are successful today. That little company, Google, they did not start out doing search engine marketing. That was their fourth or fifth or even further, business idea. And yet that's how they broke out and became one of the Magnificent Seven today. Slack started as a gaming company, and they just used this product to communicate internally. The game didn't go anywhere, but everyone's like, we love this product. Maybe we should start to push that out to the public. That's true for many companies that pivot successfully. And so that takes time to think about, okay, what do I have? How do I get it out to market? How are people going to respond? How are people going to actually use this to solve their problems? And then you keep iterating on that. If you take, 100,000, 500,000, and you just put something out there, it's going to be pretty unlikely that it's going to stick. You've just spent a lot of money and a lot of time and not have a lot of results for it.
Okay. Now, something else you hit on that I've seen as a rising trend that was a little more subtle in what you said before was the fact that because the barrier to entry is real or much more attainable for, I think, a much larger percentage of folks. Again, going back to kind of the legacy way of thinking, it used to be if I'm going to start a business, I need to get a small business loan, quit my job. I got to do all this stuff. But you even had talked a little bit and hinted at it that it's like, that's not necessarily the case anymore. You may be able to kind of start and make progress and go through those iterative exercises where it's like, well, I guess it turned out like Slack. The game wasn't really all that great, but you may be able to do some of that experimentation while in parallel still doing what it is you're doing today, which I have to imagine that's a bit of a dynamically different shift.
Yeah, I think it is. So as startups get further along, I talk to them a lot about metrics and feedback loops, but that's not to say you can't integrate that very early into what you're doing. So if you have even like a mock-up or a prototype and you're able to share that with your expected target audience and start to get some feedback, you talk to people who are not only going to use it directly, but perhaps indirectly. So instead of the consumer, you talk to adjacent businesses that work with that same target audience. And you say, hey, if I was to introduce something like this to your audience, it doesn't compete with you. Do you think the audience would respond well to it? It's these different variations of getting feedback, which plays into our conversation earlier. And I'm sure we'll come back to a couple more times about self-awareness. There are two types of self-awareness. One is the meditation, reflection, the inner work. And I think that's important. Everyone should do that. But there's another type of self-awareness where you're getting feedback from others and not just a bunch of people patting you on the back and saying, hey, it's very brave to be an entrepreneur, but it's people who look you in the eye and tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear.
Okay. Yeah. Again, those people in your life who are willing to go, I'm not seeing it, or I think there's room for you to do better. Or I think you should just toss the whole idea, which it's funny because of the work I do. I talk to a lot of tech startups who reach out to me because, they know I'm around other technologies and these other things. And there are definitely, I'm probably one of those people that is not the like, wonderful idea. I love it, because there are definitely times I've been on a call where I'm like, quite frankly, with the market, with what your product is, with the value prop you're offering, I really don't think you will be successful. I think the market's saturated. I think your competitive differentiators aren't there. You could maybe do it if you really want to put enough time and energy into it. But honestly, I think it's not going to be worth your time. And those aren't always, that reaction is not always met with a positive, like, wow, thanks for being honest type of a thing.
No, it's true. It's a tough conversation sometimes. It's the same as, our friend is dating somebody and we just think it's not going to be good for them in the long term, or they're going to make a financial decision. But I think it's important. It's important to seek that feedback, right? So let's assume that people in our audience are looking to grow and to figure things out. It's important to ask the open-ended questions. Okay, so what about this idea? What could be better about it? How do you think people will respond? Do you think there are comparable or other products out there? And you might notice these are all open-ended questions. So I'm not looking for a yes, no. I'm looking for someone to talk it through a little bit. That encourages the candor. And in fact, it's best to get candor. It's best to start with that and say, last time I had an idea like this, I mentioned it to a friend and they gave me these 3 critical pieces of feedback and they made me decide not to pursue that idea. And I really thought that was valuable. So when I tell you this idea, I'm about to tell you, I want to hear from you. Why do you think it's not going to work? That's much more interesting and valuable to me than how it could work. And you think I'm a great person.
Okay. Okay. So on the technology piece, staying on this theme of what's different, you talked about, not only and I think this is all tied to technology in that access to things, honestly, even access to customers. We're a much more globalized world now than we've ever been. So where before it might be like, well, yeah, if you open a business in your town, in your brick and mortar facility, there's only so many people you can reach. Now with the internet and laptops and all this other stuff, it's like, well, you could stand up a Shopify tomorrow and potentially have a global business overnight. But then there's also the part about, you talked about automation. And this to me is where artificial intelligence is starting to make its way into some of these decisions for companies that are doing that. What specifically are you seeing that's different there? Or some of the founders who really are being successful in those arenas, what are they doing differently when it comes to automation and AI that 10 years ago you would have gone, you can't do that. There's just no way you could do it. Where now you can go, actually, you could do it.
Right. So I'm going to take this in broader strokes, but I'll try to get into some specifics in a little bit. I would say, broadly speaking, you have to think of everything that your company does in 3 tiers. One tier is this is necessary, but often redundant. The second tier is this is important and really requires somebody to think about. And the third tier is this is highly creative and can push us in the right direction. So in that first tier of necessary but largely redundant, that's where a lot of automation is going to come into play. So think about in bookkeeping, there's a lot of recurring transactions. We've seen some of that already in Bill.com and Expensify, et cetera. I think in other areas, we can imagine those things that people used to do all the time again and again, that's going to be automated if it's not already. What we're seeing through AI is that middle tier of things where in the past it required a little bit more thinking and a little bit more flexibility because there could be multiple scenarios and how to respond. And that's going to be automated more and more as AI gets smarter and we see variation. So an example there would be customer success, where in the past we thought, oh, all customer success can't be automated. Everyone has different questions, different accents, different problems. Now we're starting to say, well, there is a finite number to all those variables I just mentioned. And then there's the higher level of you have to think about the business direction and where you want to go next. Now that's going to be informed by automation and AI, but it's still going to have a heavy emphasis on decision making. That's where people can be really creative, really thoughtful, really flexible. As markets change even faster because everybody else is using AI and automation, you're going to have to respond faster as well. That's where our brain power is going to go more and more to that third tier. So we might rely on AI and automation to do the research and the reporting, but then we're going to take that information coming in and make some really thoughtful, quick decisions.
I like how you broke that down into the 3 different categories because, well, again, I like to connect the dots between these things, but what you just described very much applies to the startup world, at least the way you frame that up. But that's also very true of some of the conversations I'm having with companies on how they're thinking about things internally, about the kind of work internal in big organizations of where can things go. And again, to your point, that bucket 1 historically was the one where everybody went to. This is super repetitive, doesn't require a lot of critical thought, not a whole lot of variance or nuance to it. It's just kind of whatever. And we've been slowly automating more and more of that. And, that stuff goes offshore. It goes through different things. Now, generative AI can do really a large majority of that with little to no oversight. But that's not necessarily new. That middle ground is where I'm seeing a lot of disruption because I don't know what your experience is in this, but I almost feel like the last few years especially have challenged that middle ground a lot, because there were a lot of things we just thought only a person could ever do this. We didn't really know the details of it, but we were just like, that's just a person can do this. And I feel like in the end of 2022, generative AI kind of tore that mask off a little bit and was like, oh, crap. Like maybe it can. And there is a little discomfort right now in, well, what can it do and what can't it do? Are you seeing similar things?
Definitely. So I think to take what you said and frame it a different way, I think we conflated complexity with innovation. So I think there were things that were so complex, we're like, okay, well, I can't just throw this into Excel or have a program.
Write a simple macro.
Right. A lot of things in that first tier we could, in the second tier we couldn't. Right. We couldn't even imagine that that was possible. Now it certainly is possible. And some people have swung the pendulum too far. They've said, well,
I agree.
Complex could be handled by AI, so we no longer have to have people involved in that middle tier. And I think that's a mistake too, because there's complexity, but there's innovation on top of that complexity. And AI is never going to think for us if we are responsible for growing the business, understanding the market, recognizing people's needs both today and tomorrow, and really coming up with all these different decisions. So AI can certainly supplement and provide the foundation for that thinking, but it's not going to replace it. And I think those companies that are like firing the whole marketing team or the whole sales team or the whole customer success team, they're already starting to, or later this year, they will hire back into those roles because they're going to see that's a failing proposition.
I was just talking about this in a thing the other day about the very thing. I know several companies that have over-indexed on that middle ground where they went, yeah, I think we could probably just have some API calls to GPT-4 take care of all this stuff and run it through some things. And they're learning very quickly that to your point, there are certain things that they just don't automate well, which before jumping to bucket 3, I actually would say that's even true of bucket 1. I think there are even some of those very robotic, task-oriented things where, yes, you may not need a team to do it anymore, but the idea of let's just hand the keys over to this and have no human oversight. I've even seen companies make that wrong assumption about bucket 1, where they're like, oh, it's always the same. We don't need anybody overlooking this. We can just automate everything. Something inevitably breaks, goes wrong, something gets disrupted. And if you over-index even in that bucket 1, I've seen it cause catastrophic failure because people just didn't realize how many tentacles those automated things had into other stuff. Like, again, like payroll. Oh, payroll, it's the same everything. Yeah, until one payroll check gets missed and the whole machine blows up, type of a thing. And I think that's where even I've observed that bucket 1, you got to be careful, even the decisions you make around that, even with the latest in advanced tech.
Right. No, I totally agree. And also, like, even if something works perfectly today, doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly tomorrow. So to add on to your point, maybe it is working well based on the past, but it is now missing the mark based on people's expectations or changes in the company or changes in the market. And so, yes, even if it's, call it 10% as an arbitrary figure, you have to spend 10% of human energy making sure it's still a relevant process, going through as if you are the customer or the user. What is your experience now as compared to how you're experiencing other companies and other products? And you have to really think, okay, is this part of where we're heading as a business? And the other piece is you want all the messaging to be consistent and aligned. So if your company is moving in a different direction, but you have processes that are now a couple years old that are fully automated, those probably do not align. So your existing and new customers aren't going to understand why your messaging is one way, but your processing is another.
On that one, that just as you were saying that came to mind for me is even, especially as I think about what you're talking about in startups, but I saw this in big. I was at GE, AbbVie, some of these big companies. One of the things that often gets overlooked is, to your point, things change and you can get stuck in the status quo that may have been developed like you said, 3, 5, 7 years ago, where you're like, well, that's what made sense back then. And you had inherently baked 20% waste into the process or something like that that was acceptable through automation. But now your company has scaled dramatically, and maybe now the technology has advanced, and you don't have to have a 20% acceptable room for waste. Now, really, your margins could be 7%. And then with the technology, and you've scaled, now that 20% went from maybe $20,000 a year in waste to $2.8 million a year in waste. And if you just automate and leave and kind of go, yeah, we're never going to touch that again. That's where I've seen companies all of a sudden they go back with a, microscope and start looking at some of these old status quo processes that maybe were acceptable the way they were before. All of a sudden you start looking at a balance sheet and you go, that's actually costing us $38 million a year that we could just eliminate just by innovating. But it took a person to actually go through and find that.
No, I totally agree. So I work with founders at the inflection point once they found product market or service market fit. And one of the things I encourage founders to do is think about the business holistically. So what you're saying is parts of the business change, parts of the market change, other stakeholders involved, they might have different needs and motivations. So you have to come back and think holistically about the whole business. The comparable analogy for anyone listening who's not an entrepreneur, if you are living by yourself, it's different than when you have a partner, different than when you get a pet, different than when you have a child. And so say like you typically walk your dog first thing in the morning, but now there's a baby. You can't just always walk your dog first thing in the morning. Maybe that baby's crying. You can't say, well, I'm going to ignore that baby because I always walk the dog first thing in the morning. So it's the same idea, just a different context.
Well, and I think that's some of the risk that comes with, and it's not that it's bad, but it's some of the risk that comes with automation is you kind of forget about it and you're not consciously thinking. And that's where if you completely take humans out of the loop on that, you don't necessarily have that oversight to even know that it's going on. And you just kind of, it's like the water that boils with the frog. It's just slowly turns up and you don't realize you're sitting in a pot of boiling water until it's too late. And so I can see where that's extremely important advice for people to take. Now let's look at the third bucket, because this is another one of the areas that seems relatively new. So going back to how is it radically different versus similar, because I want to hit on the similar things, which I hope will help encourage people who may be going, the whole world's different. But that third bucket, that has to also be a relatively new area where you say, yeah, you maybe had some things that were automated to help in your decision making, or these very complex, creative, I think the way you put it, creative and complex areas. That's not necessarily AI is going to come, nor should you even just be handing it over to automation, but it does play a leading role even in that bucket where you might go, well, AI can't do that. But it's like, well, but AI does play a role in that. Fair?
So yes, AI plays a role in it. I think successful founders and successful people in general are constantly thinking about their place in their environment, and they're recognizing the interchange between the two. So if you offshore your thinking and your recognition of your place in your environment to AI, then you're losing out on a lot of the opportunities that are going to be ahead. Some of the analogies here, like I think about the value of humanity and how people really benefit through experiences that are and will continue to be uniquely human. The idea that you can learn from failure, that you can benefit from connection, creativity, we've already talked about. This idea of purpose, and we could probably have a whole existential philosophical discussion as does AI have purpose? But really strong leaders and really strong people in your community, they have a very clear sense of purpose in what they do and what they say. And we sort of gravitate and can recognize the benefits to somebody who's very clear in their purpose. These areas of humanity make for strong leaders, people who remain influential in our thinking and in our communities. And I think it's going to continue to be important even as the technology continues to grow and evolve. So going back to this top tier, this idea of maintaining a strong sense of who you are, what your company's doing, what you're trying to accomplish, and how others can join you in that journey, that will constantly evolve. But that cannot be outsourced to AI or any other technology. We have to own that.
Well, yeah. And I think this is one of those things where sometimes when I do hear the fear mongering about what AI is doing and what it's coming and all the things, and I mean, I'm probably, I mean, I don't know. I'm really close with some of the advanced technology sides of things. And even some of the things that I see now where people go, look, it's conscious or it has complete context. And I'm like, it's actually in many ways still very dumb. I mean, it's very advanced. It can do some incredible things. But even the most advanced stuff I've seen, I'm like, I mean, it's still relatively stupid in comparison to a person who can contextualize, who can have sparks of creativity in ways that, I don't know, technology just doesn't hold a candle to it, has been my observation, which is always why I get concerned when people start thinking about handing the keys over to some of these more advanced, creative, complex things, going, well, let's just let AI make that decision. And it's like, I have not seen that go well for folks.
So people talk about the analogy of going to the doctor, and say you have a really bad pain inside and it's been there for a couple of days, so you decide to go to the doctor. But if you go to a doctor who's a surgeon, that doctor might have one recommendation. If you go to another doctor who's really interested in a pharmaceutical approach, an internist, they might have another recommendation, and you go to a third or fourth, you will get different recommendations. Doctors are very smart people who study a long time to hone their craft, and yet you're going to get widely different recommendations for the presenting problem. Bring that back to our discussion around startups and founders. They are facing incredibly complex, challenging problems that presumably society hasn't solved yet, or not as effectively as they think, and that's why they start a company in the first place. They might turn to AI for the answers. Well, you don't know if you're going to get the AI surgeon or the AI internist or a different AI trying to solve that problem. And if you outsource it, you might have a solution very appropriate for one context, but not for another context, or it might not really hit on the problem you're trying to solve exactly.
No, and that contextual problem, there's two things that, when I think about this, that I've seen has been extremely helpful in illustrating this. I think of over the years, I've had tons of interns who have worked with me, and many of them are brilliant, brilliant, brilliant people, but they don't, to your point, they don't have the context of all this stuff. And so I knew they could be extremely helpful in getting me the right information or helping weigh in on my way of thinking about things, or helping me stay current on, if I was thinking about this type of a thing, what considerations might I need to make to challenge me with different ways of thinking. But at the end of the day, I would never just take whatever they came up with and then go stand in front of the board and say, hey, here's this thing. Well, what are the questions? Why did you come up with that? Oh, I don't know. Like, my intern told me to do it type. I would never do that, because again, they just didn't have the context to know what they were doing. But the second piece with it was, and I think this is one of the bigger risks with AI, if you go too far with it in that bucket 3, it is a black box. And granted, people can be bits of black boxes too, so I don't want to paint it too separately. But I've seen organizations go too far with this, where they start to automate or just hand over keys to technology, and they don't really even understand how the technology is coming to those conclusions. I just recorded a conversation with somebody last night where we were talking about the fact that we don't always know how it's going through these neural networks and making these decisions, and what contextual pieces it's pulling in, and how it came to that conclusion. And the challenge was, then when something goes wrong, it's extremely hard to fix, because you're not even sure how it concluded or came forward with the decisions that it made, which just makes it exponentially harder to clean up.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Christopher. We don't understand what's going on in that black box. And then the second piece that I would think of a lot is the feedback loops. So AI is
Yeah.
going to come out and say, based on everything I'm seeing on the internet right now, I believe you should do this. And we think, well, AI is incredibly smart. That must be the right answer. But in the absence of feedback loops, AI is just pontificating and it's saying, okay, this is what I'm seeing. Maybe the world has changed. Maybe you're trying to anticipate the future, which is not on the internet. I mean, there are people speculating it, but the future obviously is not played out yet. You have to think about that. And also, you have to move in a way where you're taking small steps and getting feedback with every step along the way. If you just say, I'm going to take this idea that has come through my one prompt, and I'm just going to follow that idea for as long as possible. Well, in the absence of a feedback loop, you're not going to really adapt and grow along the way.
And that feedback loop is critical. And what makes that even more critical came up in this conversation I had last night about it, is the fact that what we often forget with these big AI models and things like that, because they feel like they're in real time and because they can access the information in real time, we feel like they're current in their thinking. Unfortunately, they're not, because when we think about how AI is trained, it's actually trained on a static set of data. Even though it's accessing the latest data, it's actually not trained on that latest set of data. So one of the things that's really interesting about it is its decision making, and your point of its recommendations and the things it's doing, even if it's making it in the context of current information, it's actually making it based on data it was trained on from years past, which actually can be very risky when we talk about how quickly things are moving, because you may ask it for input or advice on how to think about something, and it may not even be a decision for the future. It may be something for right now, but it's thinking about, well, what was the current state of the environment? I think of OpenAI's model, which is 2021. Well, a lot's happened in the last several years.
Of course.
And so if it's making decisions based on where the world was in 2021, even in the context of this new information, that can be really dangerous if you're not thinking critically and problem solving alongside it.
I agree with that. And I also think about AI as exponentially increasing the content creation. So now AI is going to start to pull from other AI, and presumably
it's
it
already
may be
happening.
right, or it might be, So
it's already happening on massive scale. And the disinformation, the reality that because content creation can be so ubiquitous now, it also doesn't have context. So it doesn't even know I'm using this information, but is this even the right information? I don't know. It just happens to be what there's the most of.
That's right. And you think about, so I think about bias affecting leadership, because at the end of the day, leaders are using their own brain to make decision, but also we know there is a ton of bias and we have to do our best to recognize it. So some of the biases are somebody who's good looking, somebody who's tall, somebody who is loud and boisterous. We assume that person is more of a leader than somebody who does not fit those characteristics. And there are a bunch of others I could mention too, but just in that small rubric. But in fact, when you do the research, it's the opposite. Typically, the person who's the loudest and arguing most vehemently and most repeatedly is actually not in a stronger position than somebody who takes their time and thinks through their thoughts and just says very plainly and clearly, this is what's going on. And some of those other factors too are red herrings. So presumably AI is going to do the same thing. It's going to pull from what people think are the best pieces of information, but may not at all necessarily. AI might pull from the loudest and most boisterous pieces of information out there because they're just repeated and they're more liked, on social media. So AI say, well, I guess this is the right answer. And that's just going to make decision making that much harder, not easier.
Well, and that's where I've said for years, one of the biggest risks of advanced technologies is if you don't do it right, it will just make your problems exponentially worse, exponentially faster. It's just the way it works. It's like, well, yeah, it's great. It's going to speed that train up. But if the train is on a broken track headed for a bridge that's out, you're just going to fly off that bridge a heck of a lot faster and hit the ground a heck of a lot harder than you would have in the past, where maybe you would have had time to pull the brakes and stop the train before you even got there.
That's right. That's right. It does you no good to have the right sneakers and do a lot of training. And if you decide to run in the wrong direction, you can run much
Exactly.
faster, but you're not going to get to where you want to. So that makes total sense.
So on coming into the home stretch, I do want to leave on an encouraging note for folks, because I do think there's a lot of wisdom in what we just talked about in terms of how to think about this, how to apply it, things to watch out for. But for folks who may be, I just posted a short yesterday that talked about just the change fatigue people have. And the person I was talking to was at the top of their game in the industry, and they're like, I'm overwhelmed by this. What do you see amidst all of this that you go, you know what? Yes, a lot of things are changing, but here are some things that I'm seeing are consistent, so that, yeah, you may have to adapt, you may have to tweak, but don't get too distracted by all the noise, because at the end of the day, these things, if you consistently do this, or you make these bets, they will play out well for you, regardless of what changes in the startup space or the world at large.
Sure. So I'm going to focus on three areas here, Christopher.
Okay.
One is small steps. So don't feel like you have to have the idea, the implementation, the money, everything lined up before you get started. Take that small step, talk it over with a couple friends, find people like you who are going to push back and say, oh, that may not be the best idea. Create a mock-up, draw it, use some software if you're comfortable, put it on a piece of paper if you're not. But take small steps one at a time to figure out if this thing is going to work. That's much less daunting than I need to start a company and I need $10 million to get started. Just take those small steps. The second is really think about your energy. Right now, there is a lot of noise, a lot of distractions. We didn't even get into social media, but AI alone is a ton of noise, and presumably it gives us a lot of answers, but we talked about ways it's giving us the wrong answers. Think about how you want to focus your energy. And that includes focusing on what's important to you, not only your business, but your friends and family. But also think about things you want to say no to, and not be distracted by things that are not moving you towards how you want to live your life and what problems you want to solve in your own life. So that's my thought on energy. And then around resilience, you have to figure, whether you're an entrepreneur or not, this is a long haul. There's a lot of distraction. It seems like there's a lot going on in the world. In fact, that's a bit of a misperception. It's just because social media puts the world in front of us, but the world has been dynamic this whole time. It's just we realize it much more now because we're inundated with lots of news, and particularly bad news. Well, think about taking care of yourself. Take some time away from the news, away from social media. Make sure you're getting enough sleep, you have the right diet, you're exercising as needed. These things seem like fundamental and it's easy to step aside. But if you're in this for the long game, you really need to take care of yourself, because this sense of resilience is going to carry us through to whatever the future brings. We can't control a lot of things that you and I talked about, but we can control how we live our life and how we're letting the outside permeate us.
I love those three. And I think that, again, that's good feedback and advice to anybody, regardless of whether you're in the startup world or you're just a career professional trying to figure out how to make it, or I even forget your career. I just even think of being a parent and how sometimes it's so easy just to get distracted with the noise of this and that and think you've got to solve all the big problems in one fatal swoop, and you forget to take care of yourself. And those three things are like, hey, if you actually just slow down, take a breath, and realize that, the same things, there's a consistency across the board that, yeah, even though we're in the digital world and there's new realities that we haven't experienced and there's technology that's moving things faster than they've ever moved before, at the end of the day, a lot of it really is noise. And I see that a ton, where people are freaking out and trying to change things that it's like, you have zero control over that. Even if it's true, even if your company is going to decide to wipe out your whole division with an AI algorithm, what are you going to do about it other than what you can control, which is stay calm, stay focused, focus on the things you're good at, and march forward.
Right. It's funny, everything feels impactful and important, But when trains came out, people were incredibly nervous. They're like, what is this thing? When cars came out, people thought, no way, like, that's just crazy. The world is upended. When computers came out, people thought, well, everybody's going to lose their jobs. And then when smartphones came out, everyone thought, well, I guess you don't need people anymore, and the whole world is done. These things come and go. AI is incredibly daunting. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. But to your point, we have to figure it out. We have to understand it is going to be a tool to make our lives better, and understand that it's not going to be flawless. How can we put humanity on top of AI to enrich our lives, both personally and professionally?
Yeah. And I love ending on that. And I think the other piece that I would just encourage people with, and you've probably seen this having worked with in startups yourself and then advising them along the way, and the fractional component, that you're going to make mistakes. Like we are going to make mistakes along the way. We're going to learn some things. We're going to learn some lessons the hard way. And I think that's the part that's right now, there tends to be this idea of like, how do we get it perfect? And it's like, we're not going to. We're going to flub this up big time. And maybe we can mitigate some of that risk. Maybe we can do some things differently. But ultimately, we're also going to make mistakes. And that's part of the learning process. As a learning leader, that's one of the things I'm always trying to imbue in people is like, hey, failure is part of growth. It's not something to be avoided.
Right. No, failure is definitely scary. But I, like you, it sounds like I encourage people to use the growth mindset. But let's put the psychology terms aside. That means that recognize that when you fail, you're going to be stronger. If you fall off your bike, you get back on. If you make a mistake, you've learned from that. And think back to times in the past when you failed or things didn't go the way you wanted, and how you've learned and grown from that. I'm assuming everyone who's listening has made mistakes and has learned from those mistakes, and they're much better for it. You make a mistake, talking to a friend or family member, you say something stupid and you make them upset. You end up getting a stronger relationship as long as you come back and you say, hey, I really messed up, and you're humble about it. That relationship likely is going to grow. It's going to strengthen. Yep. And so mistakes have an incredible value. Just think about how to mitigate our mistakes, but embrace them as
how to mitigate and make the right mistakes, not the wrong ones, and or at least make less of the wrong ones, because inevitably we're probably all still going to make some of the wrong ones. But if we can make less of those and mitigate it, we'll be in a better place. Well, Benjamin, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope people have found something in here, regardless of whether you're in the startup space, you're in the career space, whatever space you're in. I think there's a lot of profound wisdom that you've shared that I think anybody can take at a time when anxiety levels are high, people are exhausted, people are scared, they're trying to figure this stuff out. But really, I'm very optimistic to the future ahead. But there's some hard work ahead, but I think you laid out some great paths for how to navigate it. So thank you.
Oh, no, this has been great for me. I had a lot of fun, and I appreciate the way you summarized it right there. It is incredibly daunting, and we have to think about it a lot. But through that, there will be a ton of opportunities in lifestyle, in medicine, and in innovation. Things we can't even imagine are going to come from this. We just have to keep our head on straight and take our time and think about what's important to us.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you again, Benjamin. Thanks to everybody for watching, listening. Hopefully you got something from this, and be sure to subscribe, and we will see you on the other side.